What's up guys, my name is Ace, and today we're going to be taking a very deep look at the most effective methods for taking out vehicles as an infantry player in Battlefield 6 as well as REDSEC. With this, I did a ton of testing with pretty much everything that's capable of dealing damage to especially the armored vehicles like tanks for instance, and I'm going to be sharing the important details I found with that as well as the best methods I found overall. So let's dive right into the basics that you need to understand first, and the first big one here is the damage value that you see appear when you deal damage to a vehicle is actually a scaled value. So it treats every vehicle as if they have 1000 HP when it comes to those numbers that are displaying, even though that's not technically the case. So just as an example, if you were to deal what appears to be 200 damage to a vehicle, like that's the number you see pop up when you deal that damage, this is meant to be an indicator that you've taken 20% of the health away from that vehicle with that hit. In reality, in the case of the battle tank, for instance, this actually has 300 total HP, and that means when you're dealing quote-unquote 200 damage, technically you're only dealing 60 damage to that 300 HP. So there's fairly complicated details behind the scenes here, but the reason they do this is it just makes it much easier to read what's going on when you're dealing damage at a quick glance. So if you see that you're dealing 200 damage, you've taken 20% of the health away of that vehicle, and assuming it's not being repaired in any way, it's going to take you 5 of those exact same shots to kill that vehicle. That's much easier than trying to remember the total HP values of the different vehicles combined with how much damage the item that you're using can deal. And therefore also, anytime I bring up damage in this video, I'm talking about that displayed damage value rather than the actual technical damage that you're dealing. Next up, the important thing to know are the types of vehicles. You don't need to know the exact names of the vehicles, but the types are important, and learning how to recognize those types is also important. And you can check these out for yourself in the menu, but just a quick recap here. We have our main battle tank, our infantry fighting vehicle, or IFV, our light transport vehicle, the armored transport vehicle, and the mobile anti-air vehicle. Keeping in mind, we're just looking at ground vehicles today. And with those basics out of the way, let's first get into our deployable counters to these vehicles before getting into things like our launchers for more ranged attacks. And these are all gadgets that are tied to the engineer class. And we'll start this off with the obvious one, and probably the best one out of all of these, honestly. This is the anti-vehicle mine. With this, you simply place it down, obviously where you expect a vehicle to be traveling through. So usually like a narrowish choke point on a road or just a path that it looks like a vehicle would likely take. And also it does help to try to hide this in some foliage or something if possible, just so it doesn't stand out like a sore thumb so they can easily see it and destroy it before they get close to it. And if a tank, an IFV, or an armored transport vehicle runs this over, you will deal 770 damage to that. And that's obviously a lot of damage. That's going to be very weak from a single one of these. And keep in mind, you can throw down multiple as well, meaning if you put 2 next to each other and they run them over, that's going to be an insta-kill on those vehicles where you don't generally have the ability to insta-kill them. Now, as for the light transport and the anti-air vehicle, for both of these, a single anti-vehicle mine will take these out if they run it over. So that's the first one, and right up front, at least in the game's current state with how these are currently working, these are going to be your best bet when it comes to deployables that can take out vehicles. However, I still wanted to touch on the others to show how much damage they can deal and how to use them most effectively. Something that's actually really comparable to the anti-vehicle mines are going to be the EOD Bot Mines that you can drop. So with the EOD Bot, when you call it in, as you're driving it, you can deploy 3 mines. And these are mini mines, and therefore they don't deal as much damage as the standard anti-vehicle mines. As you can see here, we're dealing 418 damage to a tank, an IFV, or an armored transport vehicle, 665 damage to the light transport vehicle, and 570 damage to the anti-air vehicle, meaning if you do deploy all 3 of these in a cluster, you can take out any vehicle, again, instantly by doing that. And these mines are a little harder to spot as well. So there is still a decent amount of potential with those EOD Bot Mines. Then after that, let's have a look at the Tripwire Mines. And with these, if you watch a little video, it shows the player placing this on a vertical surface. So like a wall, for instance, and then if a vehicle drives by that and trips the sensor, it will shoot a projectile at the side of that vehicle and deal damage. The issue with this though, and we'll be getting deeper into this when we get into the rocket launchers, this is you deal less damage to the side of the vehicle compared to underneath the vehicle. And as a result, we'll just talk about one example here. With the tank, if the Tripwire Mine hits it in the side, it's likely going to deal around 200 damage. The angle also matters, so you will see some variance from there, but it's going to be roughly 200 damage. Whereas if you place this Tripwire Mine on the ground and it's pointing upward, and they drive over it like any of the other mines, although in this case the tracks don't have to hit it, they just have to drive over it anywhere. So it's actually a bit more forgiving for tripping. Now you're going to be dealing 436 damage consistently to the underside of that tank. That's more than double the amount of damage from a single tripwire mine, And as a result, that's just a little tip I've got for you guys. If you are going to be using these, I'd recommend putting them on the ground, even if it sounds kind of counterintuitive. Of course, this does limit your potential trigger range compared to putting it on a wall, since they do have to drive directly over it instead of just driving past it within the trigger range. But in my eyes, it's worth it, especially because these are very hard to spot on the ground. And then finally, for these placeable gadgets that deal with enemy vehicles, we have the Acoustic Sensor Mine, and this one's quite interesting. Based on what I can tell with my testing, this has a trigger range of roughly 50 meters, which is a huge trigger range, although the vehicle does have to be traveling at some speed to trigger that properly. If they're traveling really slowly, it actually prevents the trigger of this, but they basically have to be slowed down to a crawl. And with this, once it triggers, it will fire a projectile up in the air, and then it will come down for a top-down attack, which also tends to deal more damage to many of these vehicles compared to a front-on attack. And with this, against the tank, the IFV, and the armored transport vehicle, we deal 476 damage for that top-down attack, which is pretty impressive when you consider how big that trigger radius is. It's not like they have to drive directly over this, they just have to drive somewhere near it. Whereas against a light transport, this will kill it in one hit, so it does 1,000 damage against that. And against the anti-air vehicle, this does 544 damage, so 2 of these would take one of those out. Now, as cool as this might sound, it does come with some downsides. One of those downsides is it doesn't always hit. It doesn't hit every single time. If the vehicle's traveling really fast or it backs up out of that radius after triggering it and it does that fast enough, it will often just miss completely and you'll deal literally 0 damage. Also, if they manage to get right up close to it before triggering it, it may not get all the elevation it needs for a proper top-down attack, and therefore, once again, it'll hit somewhere in the side of the vehicle and deal significantly less damage. So the Acoustic Sensor Mine has potential, but it's also inconsistent, and therefore not really one of my favorites. And that right there wraps it up for the deployables. Like I said, the anti-vehicle mine is probably your best bet in the game's current state, although they are a bit easier to spot than some of these other options, and they do have to drive directly on top of them, so you are very limited with any of these deployables, really. They have their limitations, of course. You can't just spot a tank off in a distance and then decide you want to take it out by using these, unless you properly guess the path it's going to take. Next, let's have a look at some throwables, and the first one I want to look at here is the anti-vehicle nade. This is part of the engineer class, and it just does a consistent amount of damage anywhere on the tank, so this one doesn't have like sweet spots where it deals more damage or less damage on different parts of the vehicle. However, it does deal a different amount of damage depending on the vehicles. And we can see the damage values here. For something like a tank, you only deal 140 damage to this. And as a result, this isn't going to be all that effective at like actually taking a tank out. However, it's often nice if you just get a vehicle really weak, but not quite there. This is great to just push it over the edge. So I definitely wouldn't be relying on these anti-vehicle grenades, but they can be useful in some situations. However, the other throwable I wanted to look at here is quite useful against vehicles, and this is the C4, which is actually part of the Recon class. And with this, once again, it appears to deal the same amount of damage anywhere on the vehicle. And for the armored vehicles, the tanks, IFVs, and armored transports, you deal 334 damage, meaning all you need is 3 C4s directly on those vehicles in order to instantly destroy them. And this makes C4s a really solid option if you're in a situation where you're confident you can close that distance, throw 3 of them and have all of them actually land on the vehicle, and then trigger it before getting killed, which is often the difficult part here, obviously. But I did want to point out, C4s are quite effective at taking out tanks, as long as you've got 3 of them. And this is where I want to squeeze in one more additional detail here. One benefit to using the C4, the anti-vehicle mine, and the EOD Bot Mines is if you get a hit on a vehicle with any of these, it will disable that vehicle's movement for 5 seconds. And that can be an excellent benefit, not only for just slowing their advance down, but also opening them up to a really easy follow-up attack. And now let's get into the much more versatile methods of taking out vehicles. These are going to be the launchers, and all of these are tied to the engineer class as gadgets. And before we get into the individual ones, I think now is the important time to cover the different damage zones on the vehicles. All of these ground vehicles we've been looking at, aside from the light transport, have different zones on them where you deal a different amount of damage. And generally speaking, a front-on attack is going to be dealing the least amount of damage. So if you can avoid it, you generally don't want to be shooting these vehicles directly in the front, especially tanks. Then you deal a bit more damage to the sides compared to the front. Also, when it comes to the turret, damage values can be quite inconsistent on the turret, but it often at least loosely follows the side of the tank that it's on. So the front of the turret will deal damage more similar to the front of the tank, whereas the side of the turret will deal damage more similar to the side of the tank. So that's why I did also label the turrets here as part of those zones, even though it's technically separated to a degree. Whereas if you get a full-on top-down attack where you're like on an elevated surface looking directly down on the vehicle, you get a huge bonus for that. In fact, this is one of the 3 main sweet spot zones on these vehicles that can deal the same amount of potential damage here. The other sweet spot zone is the rear of the vehicle. More specifically, especially on tanks, the lower part of the rear of the vehicle. You don't want to hit the rear of the turret because you won't deal nearly as much damage there. So you want to aim a little bit lower on the rear. And then finally, the other sweet spot zone here is the underside of the vehicle, which is obviously going to be a lot more situational. It's fairly rare that you get an opportunity to shoot a rocket at the underside of a vehicle. But if the opportunity presents itself, you definitely want to take advantage of that. However, even with that in mind, you may notice some big inconsistencies with the exact amount of damage that you're dealing. And this is due to the fact that the angle of attack also matters when it comes to your damage. Essentially, the way this works is being directly perpendicular with your shot to the impact point on the vehicle. That's going to yield the most damage for that particular damage zone. Whereas as you increase the angle from there, the more you increase it, the less damage you will deal to that same zone. So let's have a look at an example here with the RPG against a tank. If I'm directly perpendicular and shoot the vehicle directly in the front at a 90-degree angle, I'll be dealing up to 204 damage. If, however, I'm at a 15-degree angle, but I hit the exact same point on that vehicle, now I'm dealing 202 damage, which is a pretty negligible change. I mean, 15 degrees isn't going to throw you off very much, but as you can see, as I continue increasing this angle but hitting the exact same point, the amount of damage I'm dealing is getting lower and lower. Now, is it a massive discrepancy? No, especially not to the front. However, when you start to look at bonus zones, this is where you really start to notice the big differences here. As we can see, our maximum sweet spot damage is 594, whereas if we shoot that same spot from a pretty extreme angle, this drops it all the way down to 343 damage. So with this, I would still say the zone that you're shooting is most important, but if the angle starts getting really extreme to the point where you're increasing the odds that you might miss entirely, you're better off just getting a more perpendicular shot on like the side of the tank, for instance, compared to the rear of the tank. So with that out of the way, these are the values I collected for all of these vehicles that I tested. Keeping in mind with these values, this is when I was trying to be as perfectly perpendicular as possible, so these should be at least roughly the maximum values you can deal to each of these zones with a perfect perpendicular shot. And you can see on the RPG here just how important it is to hit those sweet spots. So the rear, the top, or the underside of it. The rear is generally going to be the one that's most consistent for you. With any of these vehicles, the RPG has a 2-shot potential if you can hit these sweet spots. However, the next one I want to look at here is the MBT-LAW, and this launcher I really like for its consistency and ease of use. With this, the way it works is you just point and shoot at the vehicle, and it will automatically track and perform a top-down attack. So you don't have to perfectly lead your target or anything like that. This guides itself for a top-down attack, and as a result, it deals very consistent damage every single time. And while it's definitely dealing less damage than the RPG, like to a tank, you can see I'm only dealing 294 damage per shot. And this is really easy to do. You don't have to worry about getting the perfect angle and trying to hit a sweet spot or anything, or again, like leading the vehicle if it's moving. It's literally just point and shoot, and it will deal this amount of damage. So while the potential isn't as high as with the RPG, I really like the consistency and ease of use with this. As for the next one I want to take a look at, this is the aim guided launcher. And with this one, you have to guide the rocket with your aim in order to hit your target, which can allow you to do some interesting things, but it also can make it very awkward and difficult to hit your target consistently. It definitely takes some practice to get used to, but essentially after you fire it, it's going to try to track wherever the center of your screen is pointing. And with this, here are the damage values I collected. Again, trying to get as perpendicular as possible to these zones. And we can see here, the damage values are very respectable on this. Just like with the RPG, we're once again able to get a 2-shot kill to any of these sweet spot zones, if you can manage to hit them. And outside of that, especially against a tank, we're dealing more damage to the front and sides as well compared to an RPG. So there's actually a little bit more power potential out of this compared to that. However, the downsides with this are, first off, the rocket travels quite slowly, so it takes quite a bit of time to actually hit the target, especially if they're at quite a distance. And also, it does take some practice and some skill to really consistently guide this onto target in the heat of the battle when you also really want to take cover, but you often can't because you need to see where you're guiding your rocket. And this just leaves us with the long-range launcher, the Javelin. And with this one, the first key is you have to be at least 40 meters away from your target to even lock on in the first place, and you can't fire until you're locked on. So this only works at longer distances. And similar to the LAW, this does a top-down attack every single time. And here are the damage values. We can see it's going to be a 3-shot kill on everything aside from the light transport vehicle. With that one, it'll be a 2-shot kill. And while I do like this for its range potential and consistency of damage, it does have the downsides of, first, having to be at least 40 meters away from your target to even lock on. Second, you have to lock on, and that takes a little bit of time. You can't fire before locking on. And then another thing is you can't really take advantage of any sweet spots. Like, sure, it's consistent and you can deal 350 damage consistently to a tank, but that's the maximum amount of damage you can deal to that tank with a single one of these. So when it comes to fighting ground vehicles, at the end of the day, while each of these items have their own pros and cons attached to them, I would say your best option all around is going to be the RPG, especially when using that combined with the knowledge of these sweet spot zones, the areas you want to be aiming at. If you can consistently get those rear shots, for instance, you can be eating through tanks, no problem. But honestly, even 3 shots to the side of a tank, that's going to do it as well. And therefore, with all of that in mind, the RPG is my favorite here when it comes to ranged attacks in general against vehicles. Now, I was going to wrap it up here, but there's a few other really situational things I just wanted to cover here, just to be as thorough as possible. And the first one is the mounted tow turrets that you'll find around the map. These are designed for taking out vehicles, and with this, it will fire an aim-guided rocket. So just like with your shoulder fire aim-guided rocket, it will track toward the center of your screen, and it does travel quite slowly. And these are the damage values I was able to find with this. It can potentially deal a lot of damage, especially to that sweet spot zone. We're looking at like 660 damage to a tank, which is very impressive. However, the rocket on this fires very slowly, it has a super slow reload time, and obviously you're locked in position and you're a pretty easy target if you're just sitting on one of these for extended periods. So my recommendation with these is they're just excellent if you want to hop on one real quick, fire your shot, guide that rocket onto target, get your hit, and then just get off of that immediately, maybe follow it up with an RPG shot if you happen to have one, and you could potentially take a tank out very, very quickly with this. Also, I had to include a mention here, the repair tool is not only used to repair friendly vehicles or neutral vehicles, it can also be used to damage enemy vehicles. And obviously this is going to be very situational, and usually it's more to like flex a little bit and get a really fun and unique kill on an enemy vehicle. But the repair tool can actually deal a very impressive amount of damage, and therefore if you've got a vehicle weak and maybe you're out of rockets for instance, and you feel like you can close that gap, the repair tool can absolutely finish off a hurt vehicle as long as you can close that distance. And there we go. That's pretty much it when it comes to everything multiplayer-wise that I wanted to cover in this video. However, of course, on the REDSEC side of things, while all of this still applies, you have some additional options that are really good against vehicles, mainly the airstrikes that you have available. Save those for vehicles, they're excellent for taking them out, or at the very least, flushing them into a more vulnerable position. And with that, this is where I'm curious to hear from you guys in those comments down below. First off, did you guys learn anything new in this video that you were unaware of? And second, what are your favorite methods for dealing with enemy vehicles, especially enemy tanks? Just let me know down below. If you enjoyed the video, a like rating is always appreciated. And don't forget to subscribe for more if you haven't already. I'll talk to you guys next time.